companies are now realizing that just highlighting your spend or just putting out the commitment, that's actually not what builds trust.
And I think a lot of people miss the mark on is that transparency is not trust, right? Transparency is a tool for decision making that enables you to build trust, right?
Is the question on every business leader's mind right now. 3BL's video series with TriplePundit cuts through the chaos and helps you navigate responsible business. Each episode dives into the questions keeping leaders up at night, breaking down trends, cutting through noise, and uncovering what's really shaping the future.
These days, it seems trust has never been harder or more important for business to earn. Sustainability and social impact work is under scrutiny, yet many consumers, employees, and investors still expect companies to lead with their values. So how can business leaders navigate pressure from all sides, stay authentic, and build the kind of trust that lasts? Today, we're excited to dive into these questions and more with John Harper, CEO of the nonprofit consultancy FSG, and Managing Director, Dr. Noor Gafni. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Mary. Really excited for today's conversation.
Likewise.
Fantastic. And to get things started, can you tell us a bit about what you're hearing out there from FSG clients and other business leaders around building and maintaining trust? John, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the word I would use is folks are reimagining and redefining what this looks like. I think the current tensions of the moment, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, highlight that we missed something along the way. And I think folks are now getting into that reflective space of what does that mean? For some, it's around shifting some language, right? We can acknowledge that ESG, DEI, this is a little bit of alphabet soup, and no one quite knows what we're talking about. So getting more clear to what are we actually saying? What are some of those outcomes? I think is helpful. And then the other piece I'd say, which will probably be a theme throughout today's conversation, how do folks get back to the basics of the business? Yes, it's true that folks want businesses and corporations to lead with their values, but I think they want folks to do it authentically in ways that make sense for them, not sort of encroaching or moving into other aspects of life that don't quite feel authentic. So I don't think there's a single answer yet, but definitely a lot of reflecting and reimagining going on.
No, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
So I think it's a really interesting time. When I talk about trust, I talk about three factors that build trust in an organization. The first one is accountability, right? We know that companies need to be accountable to all their stakeholders, including their employees, consumers, and others, right? Investors and others. The second one is belonging. And so how do you foster a sense of belonging and connection inside your organization and with other stakeholders that feel connected to your brand, right? The third one is a sense of purpose. And so when we think about all these three factors, that's really what builds trust in an organization. And so many of these are under fire at the moment that, of course, it's really challenging to be in an environment which is trusting and, enabling people to feel confident in organizations when so many of these initiatives have to go quiet.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to hear that there is that reflection that's going on out there, that some folks are maybe rethinking. Our space loves an acronym, but that sometimes it's not always the best way to break through and get folks from all backgrounds to really understand what this work is and what we're doing with it. And Noah, you touched on this a bit, but I'd love to learn a bit more about what you all see as the factors that really drive trust, and if those factors might be changing in this landscape, if at all.
So I think the factors that drive trust are really around, how do we communicate and how can we be authentic in our actions, right? So it's not just taking the right steps, it's actually being honest around what's working and what isn't. And I think that's something that was really missing several years ago when companies made these huge commitments, not always knowing how they were going to get there, not being able to track and measure them along the way, and not really having open conversations with stakeholders around the challenges and the trade-offs that were needed, right? And so there was a hype, but it was really hard to maintain that trust as those challenges inevitably came up, right? And so with that backlash that we're experiencing now, I think companies have even more of an uphill hurdle because they need to rebuild trust from those that were really excited about these initiatives, as well as now those that are skeptical, right? And so it's a really, really tricky time. But to your point, there are so many things that we can do to rebuild it.
Absolutely. And I think that we've touched on this before in our conversations. John, I'd love to hear a bit more from you on this as well.
Yeah, I think a little bit of what comes up for me is even the idea of a standalone DEI program, a standalone ESG program, or my Supplier Diversity Council does this thing over here. Even that setup in and of itself is fundamentally problematic, right? If you think about many of those roles, oftentimes people envision their role of, if I'm the corporate CSR lead, the majority of my time is spent out in the community, demonstrating all the great work that we do out in the community. And every now and then I come back to try to communicate progress back in. And most folks historically would say it's about a 70 out here and 30% inside, maybe a little bit worse than that, actually. If you actually flip that back on its head and say, if my job is to better understand what the business needs based on how those connect to community needs, so that I'm not just in this space of I'm the champion always bringing that thought in, but actually I know that this person who sits in this business is looking for this answer, and we might have a community partner that's working on that exact challenge. Or if we need to bring in a focus group to explore X, Y, and Z, how do we tap into these deep community relationships that we have towards that objective? The ability and the willingness to do that sort of connection between what's our purpose, but even more explicitly, what is our business strategy? What are folks struggling with? Now retired, but really respected, responsible business leader that's a former client said to her person that came after her, you got to walk the halls, right? Like, you're spending all this time presenting the great work of your foundation partners and thinking that's what the win is, and it's not. You got to walk the halls to your peers on the senior leadership team to better understand what are their challenges, where are they running into barriers, and how are the things that you're presenting solving those things. So I think it's about building some of that trust internally, doing that sort of relationship building and connections across the business, as much as the specifics of the programs that we might offer externally.
That's such interesting feedback. It's not just about reinforcing and continuing to build trust with our external stakeholders, but also thinking about new ways of working and how we can really connect with our own teams and bring more people into what we're doing inside this work. And on that same line, Noah, I'd love to come back to you and just explore more about some unexpected ways that businesses can build trust that maybe folks aren't thinking about right now.
So I think one thing I'm really excited about is new forms of governance and thinking through ways that companies can actually connect their stakeholders, their communities, their external partners with their employees in order to drive better decision making. And so last week I was with one of our clients, a Fortune 500 company that has a responsible business advisory council. And this council is actually working with senior leaders in that organization in order to support decision making and really make sure that as they enter new markets, as they think through community partnerships, they're able to do that authentically and meaningfully. The second thing I think is really looking through models of emerging tech and really figuring out how do we take some of these emerging ideas like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations that make collective decision making, and maybe think about ways that it can apply to our work. Now, of course, a Fortune 500 company is not necessarily going to, make decisions by committees, but I do think there are ways that we can look at AI and blockchain and other types of new technologies to really inform our decision making and create that real-time feedback loop.
And that is unexpected because people might not think about AI at first when they think about building trust. And I'd love to come back to that later. But John, first, love your feedback on this.
I totally agree with Noah, and I actually think this isn't disconnected from the AI front, but for me, it gets to the question of measurement. Oftentimes when we talk about social commitment, social impact commitment, sustainability commitments, we're focusing on the spend, which is frankly just an input, right? We want to move. We had some clients reach out to us back in the wave of racial reckoning back in 2020, 2021. We made a $100 million commitment towards racial equity. We are now $80 million in, and we want you to tell us how we're doing towards that objective. Now, we can put aside for a second, how would you deploy $80 million and you have no clue what you're actually striving for, right? Like, I'm glad that we're working towards systemic racism, but I don't think $80 million is enough to get us there. And so what will we expect to see as a result of that change? That's one. And then I think perhaps, what does that actually mean for your business? If you were to solve whatever those outcomes were out in the world, what does that therefore mean for your business? That builds my commitment, my buy-in, my trust that I understand what you all are going after, and I can buy into this vision of what we're trying to get to at the end. And we're in a relationship with a lot of folks who are in the racial equity movement. And while I think folks are grateful that they got these big dollars a few years ago, that's not actually what folks were asking for. folks were asking for transformed outcomes, for different experiences when they went into stores, for greater banking opportunities in low and marginalized communities. How do we get to that regardless of the spend conversation? I think companies are now realizing that just highlighting your spend or just putting out the commitment, that's actually not what builds trust. What builds trust is being able to tell that story of the transformed outcomes, what it means for the communities and the customers and other stakeholders that you're working for, and importantly, what it means for your business, because we appreciate that's why you're here. We got to connect those two things more effectively.
Absolutely. And to expand a bit more on that, what is something maybe that businesses think helps them to build trust, but maybe is not doing such a great job of that?
Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate this point. I think it's the focus on the commitments, right? Like I think many folks know that when we see this big dollar commitment, a lot of that is a roll up of programs that already existed. It doesn't speak to the outcome that we want to see in the long term. I'm not suggesting it's not meaningful, but it doesn't actually help me understand why you're doing it. Think about something like a supplier diversity spend. We like to focus on, we're going to get X amount of dollars to these marginalized businesses. Why do you care? What does that mean for your bottom line? Why should we be holding you accountable to that? That's different than saying we want to expand access to opportunity so that we always have access to the best suppliers that might be out there and maintain our competitive advantage. If both are done well, you will increase the amount of marginalized and low income and people of color businesses that are in your supply chain. But one certainly builds more trust from my perspective instead of just this lofty figure of sort of how much you're trying to get to from a spend perspective.
And that example is so helpful. You can really hear the difference in those two framings and how audiences would really perceive that. And Noah, I'd love to build on that with your perspective as well.
So what I think is really interesting, and I think a lot of people miss the mark on, is that transparency is not trust, right? Transparency is a tool for decision making that enables you to build trust, right? So the dollar commitments, the scope 3 emissions, these are just a first step, right? And so they need to be taken into account and they need to lead to more action. And I think we focused so much on reporting, announcing the PR, right? The compliance, and not really around how does this transform our business? How does it transform our relationships with communities? How does it transform the way we want to work? And so I think those are the things that often companies miss the mark on because they're focused on reporting or communications as opposed to these are really the first step in the process.
Very well said, Noah. I will just say, as a CEO myself, that lesson, that transparency itself is not trust, it is a tool towards trust, is one of the greatest missteps that I think a lot of folks in our seat struggle with. That is just a step on the path towards something greater. It's a good reminder. Just sorry for jumping in, Mary. Just wanted to say, I totally agree.
Please do. No, absolutely. I think it's so helpful because it's like, you make the commitment, you continue to report on it. Some may say, well, I've continued to report on it. Doesn't that mean that folks will trust that I'm doing what I say I'm doing? But why? What is the outcome? What are those stories? I think that both of those perspectives are so helpful as folks are trying to navigate the situation we're in right now. To kind of wrap us up here, I'd love to talk a bit about the future, about what we're building toward, about the next frontier of trust building and connecting with your stakeholders. What do you really see as what will matter most over the next 5 years, 10 years that companies should start working on now when it comes to building trust with your stakeholders? And Noah, I'd love to start with you here.
So I'm really interested in how we can loop companies into the macro perspective. And I really think we need to rebuild trust in capitalism and stakeholder capitalism in particular. So I think this is one opportunity where we've really lost our way in terms of public trust in these initiatives and these types of approaches to capitalism, to the way that companies work. And I actually think that if companies were able to rebuild trust with communities, with their employees, with their customers, with their investors, and with their stakeholders around these initiatives, right, in terms of accountability, belonging, and purpose, I actually believe that that will ladder up to big systemic changes as well.
Absolutely. And John, love to go to you next.
So I don't disagree with Noah. I think I'm also in a place where, If anything, the last 5 years taught us that it's difficult to predict the next 5 years. And to some extent, there's
us on our toes here.
Those who've at least, I think, been thoughtful about some of the variety of what those different scenarios could be in the future are sometimes who win more than those who predict this is the exact thing that we should be doing. I only offer that up to say that I think a couple of things are bubbling up for me. In our work, we often talk about this idea of an eco-cycle, that if you think about a forest fire, what happens after the destruction, things rebuild, there's a regrowth to it. Sort of acknowledges oftentimes we focus on the maturation and the growth side. Truth is, there's a back loop, and that creative destruction is real. If I pull myself up from today's moment, there's an element of creative destruction that's happening, at least within American society. Reimagining the role of the federal government, reimagining how nonprofits show up. Again, I'm not suggesting what's right or what's wrong, just acknowledging this is a moment of shift and transition that I think all of us can appreciate. If that's real, what's on the horizon? If there's rebuilding that's going to be necessary, if there's reimagining of how folks are going to show up at local levels or at state levels, how are we engaging in that conversation? What does it mean for our stakeholders? Certainly, what does it mean for our business? And what do we do about it right now? Right? Like, that's actually the question that I want folks to be in. I'm not sure what the answer is, full transparency, but I think more folks got to get into that conversation, because that feels like what the next 5 years is going to be focusing on. As we move through this creative destruction, what are we rebuilding towards? And how do we get thoughtful and strategic and sort of visionary about that?
Couldn't agree more. This is so helpful. And I don't think we'll come to a final answer today, but we would love to stay in touch with you, to have you back and really continue this conversation. So thank you so much, John and Noah, for being here, for everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks for the opportunity.